Okay, Salaam Alikum. Hello, welcome to this Leaders Forum of Muslims for Britain. My name is Raghi Omar. I'm a broadcaster and a writer, and I'm very happy to have been asked to moderate this very impressive panel and chat and a virtual iftar with lots of very interesting guests from the world of politics, business, philanthropy, social activism, community organization, and writing. So I'll get straight to the point. I'm very, very pleased, first of all, during this whole discussion to be joined by Aftab Chugtai. And now, Aftab, I've got a very long and incredibly impressive roll call, a drum call of all the things that you have managed to sort of be able to do in the national life of this country. You've got Aftab is someone with over 30 years of business experience in retail outlets across the Midlands. He's also got extensive board experience in the public sector. He chairs the Independent Advisory Board with West Midlands Police. He's been asked to be on the Birmingham Muslim Burial Council. He's the vice chair of the Saltley Business Association. He's been asked to be on the Grenfell Task Force Board, and on in NHS and many other different roles. Salaam Alikum, Aftab. It's very nice to have you here.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Aftab, I hope that sort of did even just a little bit of partial justice to the things that you've been involved in. But one of the things I want to concentrate on is that 4 years ago, Muslims for Britain came about. You were at the heart of that organization in its birth, and you ran an incredibly successful Brexit campaign whilst you were fasting for 15, 16, maybe even longer, 17 hours in each day. And there's about 3 or 4 questions within that sort of proposition I've just put to you. First of all, I suppose we should really sort of start, because this is going to be sort of seen by people who know a little bit about Muslims for Britain or may not know anything about it. So before we get to the other parts of that, what was the whole idea and ethos behind Muslims for Britain?
I suppose, first of all, with Brexit, because my background is a business background, and 99% of the trade I do and my members do is with the rest of the world, and it isn't with Europe. On top of that, with the boards I have sat on, I have always been the interface with the grassroots, the public, and the statutory partners. So I saw an opportunity, along with certain colleagues, where the mainstream politicians weren't really trusted by the communities. The messages were getting lost in between. So we saw an opportunity where we can actually get the message out to our grassroots communities so that they can understand a clear message from people within their communities that they trusted.
So it was, if I could sum up, I mean, both your involvement, deep involvement within the sort of business community and community at large, made up of all manner of businesses, I mean SMEs and larger, and also just, I suppose, what really motivated and that sort of lack of political connection between what was going on the front pages and what people were really sort of feeling. What was your motivation though? I mean, what made you throw yourself into this?
I think firstly, it was a unique opportunity where I have 3 young children myself, and 2 of them are in university, so not that young, and 1 is in school. So it was actually trying to give them a chance, and they helped out in the referendum as well, so that we can have a better future for them, and we can actually have a voice, we can actually influence and make their future better for them.
What do you think? I mean, from having seen it on the doorsteps, on the pavements, on the in all the sort of small businesses. What do you think that the success of Brexit, from your vantage point, what was it rooted in? Why did people go for Brexit in parts of British society, in parts of the British Muslim community, that people thought, in traditional thinking, that sort of message would not have resonated? What was the success behind it, do you think?
I think it was the honesty of the message. It wasn't the headlines that they were seeing on the newspapers and everything. It was actually their lived experiences. So, for example, where a family wanted to bring their grandmother over for a wedding, or their auntie over for a wedding, and they were refused, yet they could see how easily 500 million Europeans could come and go. But for one grandmother that wanted to come to a wedding, she just couldn't come. So these are lived experiences which the actual communities, when we were out there, they could see, well, actually, this is the reality on the ground. And they could see where, by working together, we could actually change those outcomes, so make it more fairer, so that everyone had the same chances of coming over, and basically a fairer society. And plus, a lot of the communities that we were dealing with, they had family connections with the Commonwealth countries, and the actual so the thought of being able to do free trade deals and have this better trading relationship with these with their mother countries, which have been forgotten for so long. So those kind of messages were easy because it was the lived experience. And this is what I think a lot of politicians and people miss, that you have to give more credit to people in the communities, that they do know what they're talking about. It's not just, oh, we were sold this or sold that. Yeah. They are living those.
Okay. I want to go to Atifa Shah quite soon, who's the chief executive. But just one more question to you as chairman of Muslims for Britain. Was it a hard sell? I mean, within the British Muslim communities and where you were with that message? Because obviously the whole issue of Brexit spans lots of different sort of areas, from sort of trade and identity and immigration and so forth. Was it a hard sell?
I personally don't think it was. I was always surprised. We had a lovely lad called Raj, who's a Hindu community, who worked with Muslims for Britain to actually spread the message throughout the West Midlands. So our appeal, you will have people, not everyone obviously went the same way as we did, but we had a broad support, and more so than I think we expected, and from other communities as well who joined up because they could actually see the power in the message.
After, thanks very much indeed. That's really interesting. And from Chairman of Muslims for Britain, it's delightful to be able to ask and invite Atifa Shah, who was the chief executive of the organisation. Atifa's in sunny Rochdale, for which she was the 2019 general election candidate. She's also a former youth member of parliament. She's an entrepreneur, philanthropist, and has combined, a successful management consulting career with a really high-profile community activism and involvement at local, national, and international level. She's experienced at board level in both the public and private sector, and has advised multinational corporations and governments and NGOs. And she is passionate about delivering change and bringing the energy and professional discipline and flexibility to all the sort of aspects of British life. Are you there, Atifa?
Yes, I absolutely am.
Very, very nice to have you with us. Just following on from what Aftab was saying, I mean, in your thoughts, what is the importance of an organisation such as Muslims for Britain that you are CEO of? Why is it important? Why do we need it?
So I think in order to understand the importance of an organization, it's very important to understand what it is that we're actually trying to address. Now, the complex mix which makes Britain's many communities, I guess, is undergoing rapid and profound change. And as the world continues to accelerate towards, I guess, an even more highly interconnected and interdependent set of societies, I feel like we're seeing a genuine fight in the Western world about what politics should actually look like. And I think we're going to continue to see increased competition between political and cultural blocs. Now, the challenge, I guess, that we have as centre-right thinkers is how best do we communicate conservative ideas in a way that communities understand? And how best do we champion the principles of individual liberty, property rights, limited government, a strong defence, and free markets, all, I guess, underpinned and secured by the rule of law? Now, these challenges, I have felt, and I know many will agree with me, are significantly amplified in some minority communities. Who have for far too long not been the focus of the centre-right. And it is that issue that I believe that we can address very decisively and very permanently.
So I take it from your very last sort of point that one of the things that really motivates you about your role in Muslims for Britain and why you feel it's an important organisation is to start to address that lack of narrative between people who are of the centre-right to the British Muslim community. You feel that that bridge has not been connected.
Absolutely.
Look,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I guess, I'd love to talk a bit about my motivation for why I'm doing this. And, for me, Britain is the greatest country in the world. And, every day we strive to be brilliant in everything that we do. Now, post-Brexit, the opportunities to address, some of the issues that I've talked about are so great for Britain. Not just to be a global leader in trade, but to be a global leader in entrepreneurship, in manufacturing and technology. We have a great history, and our country is boundless. And so many people have made this country, their home. And right now, with these opportunities, I want to ensure that together Britain remains a free and prosperous nation. And like many others, I don't want to leave a Britain that's less free than the way that we inherited it for the next generation. And I guess building a strong Britain, I think is one of the greatest gifts that we can pass on. And the only other thing that I will say is that, the commitment and energy of our supporters that I see motivates me immensely. And it is precisely that, together with our supporters, I know that we can build a country where freedom and opportunity can rise, and prosperity and civil society can flourish.
And very quickly, you feel positive about the future for Muslims for Britain. I mean, based on what you've said.
Absolutely. That's why I'm leading this organisation.
Of course. Thanks very much indeed, Atifa. I'm very happy to also welcome to the chat Zak Khan. Hello, Zak.
Hi.
Nice to have you. You're a solicitor, renowned solicitor with a decade of experience in the corporate and commercial and family field and much else beside. You're, again, another person who's very experienced at board level and a legal advisor to businesses and family offices. And in 2004, Zak was awarded for his contribution to the City of Manchester by His Royal Highness Prince Charles. And much else besides. And you've advised RSC Capital, the Life Science Division Limited, and been involved in philanthropy and activism. But first question to you, Zak, is that actually you've really been involved, I mean, given what's been happening in our country and around the world the last sort of 8-9 weeks or more, in trying to sort of respond at a grassroots level to the coronavirus crisis. And you've been helping to lead a response campaign. Tell me what you've been up to and what the campaign's been about and what it's achieved.
Well, at such a difficult and unprecedented time, we wanted to come together to show our support for public services such as the NHS. I have a sister who's a doctor, and I guess I understood the pressures that they undergo by risking their own lives and putting other people's lives first. They go above and beyond their duty. I have elderly parents, and I know how much they rely upon me to obtain necessities. So I guess we asked ourselves, what is it that we can do to make lives just that little bit easier? We launched our campaign on social media, asking for people to come forward and lead local networks of volunteers. And the response was fantastic. Within 5 days, we had over 100 volunteers throughout the UK. Since then, we've provided over 25,000 hot meals and household necessities to the NHS workers, the key frontline workers, the elderly, and the homeless. We didn't just stop there. When there was a shortage of masks, which was reported, local women from the community reached out and offered to sew masks. So we obtained the World Health Organization guidelines for producing homemade masks and shared this through our volunteers network. And now we're distributing over, I think, 1,500 masks are being produced and distributed on a weekly basis. Whilst being out in the community, we've also recognized that there's a need for food parcels, and our volunteers have since packed and distributed over 10,000 food packages to the vulnerable and elderly in particular.
That's fantastic. I mean, going back to, well, congratulations to you and all the volunteers for such a amazing response at a time such as this. But I mean, coming back to, Muslims for Britain and your involvement, what role do you think that Muslims for Britain, aside from the obvious and the political, what role do you think it can play at a grassroots level, given how so important we've seen over the last sort of few years on many different aspects, the necessity for grassroots engagement is in life? What role do you think that Muslims for Britain can play at the grassroots level of national life?
In my opinion, I think Muslims for Britain has an opportunity to set an example of civic duty in a way that people can really engage and relate to. Civic duty, charity, being kind to others is core practices of Islam. It's embedded within our religious culture and history. I guess it's also an opportunity for us to play a leading role in championing the health and economic resilience of our societies. I look forward and think that our campaigns have evidence that we are able to foster meaningful dialogue, drive collaboration and inspire collective action. And this wouldn't have been made possible without the generous donations of time and money from the Muslim community.
Okay, Zak, thank you very much indeed. I'm very delighted to say that we are joined on the line also for this virtual iftar to Dan Hannon. Hello, Dan. I can see you. Oh, well done. Yep, I can now both see and hear you, which is just the way we want it. How are you?
I'm very well, and it's great to see so many of my friends from the Muslims for Britain committee here. Salaam Alikum to you guys. And I've got to say, there's really, I think there's been a lot of online iftars, and people have been doing all sorts of imaginative things during the quarantine. But I can't imagine that there are many others where actual official hampers of iftar food have been distributed. Muslims for Britain, as usual, leading the way, leading the pack. But to make a sort of semi-serious point about all these dates and figs and so on that have come, it is a reminder of how important trade is, right? And this is a point that I think needs making during this epidemic. A lot of people are saying, the coronavirus shows that we need to be more self-sufficient. It shows that we need to produce more of our own food. Do you know what? It shows exactly the opposite. The epidemic hit in April, during what's called Britain's Hungry Gap, the winter vegetables have run out. We're not producing any more potatoes or cabbages or turnips. We haven't had the first harvests yet. The global food markets worked beautifully. And if they hadn't, we'd have just been living on rhubarb, asparagus, and nettles for the whole of the coronavirus. So trade is a good thing, and importing things is a good thing. But also, I think a particular role for Muslims for Britain in this debate is to remind everyone, British Muslims and British non-Muslims, of the mercantile history of Islam. And it was that first led, in the reign of the first Elizabeth, England into alliance with the Muslim states, because we were having so many quarrels with neighbouring European countries that Elizabeth I reached out to the Moroccans and the Turks and the Iranians and said, your enemy's enemy is my enemy. And by the way, let's do lots of trade. And of course, they all responded.
Well, that's one of the things that's very sort of interesting. You're absolutely right. I mean, once we're having sort of quarrels with sort of Philip of Spain, I mean, Queen Elizabeth I was getting on very well with Suleiman the Magnificent and much else besides. But what was the genesis of your, I mean, you've written a lot about it. You've talked a lot about it, this relationship between Islam and trade and your understandings. I mean, first of all, how did you come to that? And what have you learned?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes these things are more obvious, if you're looking from the outside. So if you are brought up in a Muslim religious tradition, then the idea that the Prophet is fundamentally a businessman and an entrepreneur and a trader is not the first thing that would strike you about him. It sometimes can be a little bit clearer if you're looking with some perspective. But it's an extraordinary story, and I think a neglected one, that in the immediate aftermath, in the early caliphate, Islam created a global trading empire based on a gold standard and based on free exchange, based on something very close to what we would now call a joint stock venture with limited liability in the camel trains. And there's a lot of evidence of this from the texts, from the hadiths, from early history. When the Prophet was in Medina, there was a scarcity, there was a food shortage, and the leaders of the community said to him, "You need to tell them to cut their prices in the market." But of course, he was a businessman, so he knew that would be the wrong decision, and he's reported to have said, "Provision is in the hands of God." Now, it took Western economics another 1,000 years to catch up with the idea that there wasn't an intrinsic price, that a price is just what people should pay at that moment. And so why is this worth stressing? Well, I think that the forgetting of that tradition has deleterious consequences for the world, not only in Muslim countries. I think the writer Ed Hussein talks about what he calls, in the Iranian context, the Red-Green Alliance, the alliance between Marxist economics and kind of teenage anti-colonialism and religious fundamentalism. And in a softer form, I think this has infected a lot of minds. There's a general feeling that you must have come across it reporting in the various places that you have around the world, in a lot of Arab and other Muslim countries, where people will say, free markets are a kind of Western thing. Yeah. Stock exchanges are an Anglo-Saxon thing. The opposite. If anything, the opposite is the case. The real imposition on the Arab world, if you're really looking for a kind of Western imperialism, it's not the stock exchange, it's Baathism, it's Nasserism, it's Arab socialism. And recovering the tradition of free markets, I think, is a very good thing for the region and for the rest of the world.
If you look back then through the sort of telescope of that very sort of rich history, and you're right, first of all, I should sort of join you in congratulating Muslim for Britain's amazing sort of hamper, and incredibly well, I can't wait to sample its goods, but really well thought out in terms of its sort of linkage between this country and its trade with the nations of which the produce is represented in that hamper. Looking back through the sort of telescope of history, what about our relationship now, moving forward with post-Brexit with the Muslim world? I mean, how do you how do you sort of see that? Do you think this is a sort of opportunity within the context of sort of global Britain? I mean, you know, because there are a lot of sort of issues, shall we sort of say, in the Muslim world that could block that. I mean, how do you see things?
Sure. Well, it's a really good question. I think, first of all, Britain, of course, we are partly a European country, but we've never been only a European country, and particularly we are linked by migration, by history, by language, by law, to every continent, to English-speaking Commonwealth countries all over the world, many of them Muslim majority states. And so this is not, you know, if you like, this is not a new question. It was very striking when we relived the centenary of the First World War, as it were, in real time, that the British Army in 1918 looked a lot more like the Britain of 2018 than the Britain of 1918. Right? So, you know, at that time, the vast majority of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. This is not an unprecedented. But, you know, I think we could have a great role again as a centre of Islamic finance, as a centre of trade, as a place where continents meet. But it is also partly a question of what happens in various Muslim countries. I think I don't talk about the Islamic world. I think you know, we're talking about billions of people. But I'm very encouraged by the story. We're coming up now to the 10th anniversary of the guy who began the Arab Spring in Tunisia, Bouazizi, the market trader, right? A great inspiring story, because his was fundamentally a battle
to make a living.
Property rights. Yeah, right. The freedom to enjoy his own stuff without interference from a corrupt government, right? And I think almost everyone can relate to that story. And certainly his story is absolutely rooted in the Muslim tradition, right? You go right back to the first caliphs, to Umar, to Abu Bakr, who say, we do not have authority except insofar as we're doing the right thing. The law is above me. You know, Umar publicly punished his sons to show that no one is above the law, right? And similarly, Bouazizi was saying, just because you're in government doesn't mean that you get to push me around outside the rules. And he was, of course, driven to the hideous extreme of self-immolation. Yeah. But in the end, people rose up all over the region in favor of liberty and property. And I think that's, you know, as a free market conservative, I regard that guy as a hero. But I think, you know, if I were a free market Muslim, I would feel so even more, right? Because he was doing so very, very much within the tradition rooted in his own soil.
If I could sort of go back to you, Iftar, well, because I do want to sort of talk a lot more about Muslims for Britain as an organisation. I mean, it's changed the narrative quite a lot within the context of the British Muslim sort of community and the whole issue of sort of, you know, Brexit and centre-right sort of thinking. Do you feel, I don't know what the question is, do you feel it is really much more an established, you know, mainstream idea that centre-right, you know, politics and ideas is fundamental to how British Muslims, in all their diversity, I mean, whether they're sort of Sudanese or Somalis or Iraqis or Pakistani born, that centre-right ideas, you know, belong in the politics of the British Muslim community, if you see what I mean?
Definitely. I mean, I was surprised how closely our Muslim values, our family values, our property rights, and how close they actually match with conservative values line. So I personally feel that speaking to Muslim communities of all different nationalities, I found them to be much more conservative in their thinking, in their actual lives than even they realize. And actually explaining to them, well, actually your lifestyle and your thoughts and your traditions actually are more conservative and bring you into the conservative fold rather than any other mainstream party.
And if I could come to you, picking up on what Iftar was sort of saying, and I was putting that point earlier to Atifa about this bridge, which hasn't really sort of existed between centre-right thought, centre-right and free trade and centre-right political ideas around liberty, trade, whatever it is, and the British Muslim community. Do you think that, what should Muslims for Britain be doing? And do you think that they could be a really sort of fundamental part in creating that sort of bridge? As someone who is from the centre-right, who's written a lot and written 9 books, but yet knows a lot about sort of Islamic sort of society and history.
Yes, thank you. I should say that today I haven't been observing the fast in general, but today I have not eaten anything. If only because I knew I was doing this tonight, and I wanted to get into the mood alongside you guys. So I appreciate kudos to any of you who has been fasting at these latitudes when Ramadan is at this time of year. But in terms of the values of British Muslims, yes, I think what you say, it ought to go in a way without saying. If people voted their values, then I think British Muslim voters would have behaved differently over the last half century, right? If people were just saying who's for family, who's for enterprise, who's for the rule of law and all the rest of it. That initially didn't happen for a whole bunch of historic reasons.
Sure.
And again, we should be very careful of talking about British Muslim voters. As you said, there are Bangladeshi voters and Iraqi voters and people of different heritages. But in a way, it was unsurprising that a lot of first-generation migrants from Muslim countries were going to vote for a left of centre party because they were generally an industrialised factory workforce. They would have. The chances are that they would have been voting for a centre-left party in Pakistan or in any other country, right? The really interesting question is, when we're now looking at the children and grandchildren of those, that shouldn't apply anymore. And I think particularly at this last election, we saw so many established traditional voting patterns breaking down. So many seats that had been held by one party or another, for decades or forever, switching hands. And I think we have an opportunity now to see that, if you like, that British Muslims are part of that transformation.
Very quickly, because I want to go from you straight to Saqib, who I hope has sort of joined us. What needs to happen on the other side of that conversation, Dan, within conservative, political sort of thought and movements to make that a reality? You can see the question I'm sort of getting at, because that's been a bit of a lost opportunity for very different reasons over the last.
No, I agree. There have been problems. I mean, I think that there would be 2 kinds of people who would have a problem with the concept of an organisation called Muslims for Britain, right? There would be 2 different kinds of critics who would object to the very idea of a patriotic British Muslim. One would be the sort of white supremacists. They are very few in number, and they would struggle to accept that you could be a patriotic Brit and a Muslim. They are generally people who are active online, but electorally insignificant. You could barely fill a cinema with them. Then there is a slightly bigger group made up of people who I think of themselves as being progressives, for whom the most important point about British Muslims is not that they are Muslims, but that by and large they are brown-skinned. And therefore, they're supposed to be part of an oppressed group and have no business being patriotic, right? If they're patriotic, it's somehow because they've been deceived, they've been fooled, or they've been sucked into the patriarchy. Now, and the people watching this know that is nonsense, right? People make up their minds as individuals. And I think a lot of people find it patronizing to be put in boxes. But those are the 2, if you like, the 2 different people, the 2 different sets of critics that we're trying to prove wrong.
Okay, Dan, we'll come back to you later. Thank you very much indeed. It's great to have you. Stick around, do please, because I'm sure there'll be lots more sort of, free-flowing conversation. Other people want to sort of jump in. I want to sort of move things along because I'm really delighted to say that we're now joined by Saqib Bhatti, who's the Conservative MP for Meridian and the co-founder of Muslims for Britain. Saqib, welcome. Salaam Alikum.
Salam. Thanks, Raghi.
It's lovely to sort of have you here. You were born in Walsall in West Midlands. You were educated King Edward VI School in Edgbaston before you went to LSE, where you read law. Salib says, the biggest influence on me is my father, who moved to the UK in the 60s in pursuit of the great British dream. And he taught me that the values of hard work, integrity, determination have driven my life so far. Salib, I mean, congratulations, first of all, on what was an absolutely thumping majority.
Before I came into politics, I was a chartered accountant. The day before I got selected as a candidate, I was doing tax returns for my clients. But all of a sudden, my life changed, and we had this snap general election called, and I had 6 weeks to make the case for, in Meriden certainly, why the Conservative manifesto was the right one. Fundamentally, I don't think I'd ever class myself as a politician. I'd say I was a business person. I was lucky enough to be the president of the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce, which is one of the oldest chambers of commerce in the world, from the birth of the Industrial Revolution. One of the largest, and I had the privilege of being the youngest president in their 205-year history. I was
going to say, you must have been one of the youngest by a long way.
By a considerable amount, and the youngest in the country, I'm told. But I was actively involved in the business community, and you mentioned my father in the run up to this, and really, it was my father who instilled these principles of serving the community that you are in and trying to make society better. And that was always the thing that drove me. Alongside that, I had the privilege of meeting Dan back in October 2015, and we started to talk about the referendum and the role of British Muslims in that debate. And actually, I think I was going to say we both came to the agreement, but I think Dan sort of taught me about this and told me that actually there is a massive role for the British Muslim community and ethnic minorities as a whole in the debate. And there was a real risk, actually, Raggy, that we may leave them behind if we didn't do something like Muslims for Britain. So it was absolutely essential. And what we basically put together was this messaging around pro-democracy, pro-rule of law, internationalist, pro-immigration, this idea that we can get back in touch with our heritage, with the Commonwealth, and make the case for why a global Britain can be so successful and why we had a hand in that. During that campaign, I was invited to join the board of Vote Leave, and which was a real privilege to be right at the top of the table, top table, trying to be part of that campaign, which has pretty much transformed the way this country is going to operate for the next few decades, really, or longer.
I was really interested by what you sort of said earlier in this conversation between yourself and Daniel, whilst the sort of the campaign for Brexit was going on, that you felt that it was important that the British Muslim community did not get left behind in this kind of very, very transformational sort of debate. Was that one of the central sort of, quite aside from the fact that you were sort of intellectually convinced by the argument, was that a main motivator as to why you wanted to join a Leave campaign and help form Muslims for Britain?
Partly, yes. I mean, we live in a society now where everything is so black and white. You're either this or you're that. But actually, Raggy, I think everyone on this call will accept that life does not work like that. And I knew, and you'll see from the people on this call, that there are plenty of good British Muslims, centre-right leaning, conservative Muslims who believe in free trade, who believe in the idea that if you are given the opportunity, we can make something of ourselves. And I think Artifa touched on it. This is one of the greatest countries in the world. It is the greatest country in the world. We have, if given the right opportunities, we can absolutely, grasp anything that comes our way. So it was a real opportunity to make sure that we had a forum for people to get involved in. And the key thing actually was we actually had non-British Muslims going into mosques for us, and we went into, we were in people's front rooms, and, we had TV interviews, we did all sorts of things. But it wasn't just about doing ethnic media, it was about getting that message across and putting that positive message about why we could thrive outside the European Union.
Now that you've been an MP, I want to sort of get back to ask you just what's it been like? It must have been, of all the times to have become a sort of a first-time elected MP, the last sort of 6 months must have been quite unbelievable. But I want to ask you the kind of question I was asking Dan a bit earlier, which is that now you are within, I wouldn't call it be so, churlish to say the system, but I mean, now that you are a Conservative member of Parliament, what do you see your role and the role of Muslims for Britain to try and change the conversation within centre-right, politics about engaging with this, second, third, maybe even fourth generation of British Muslims who are here, about the appeal of centre-right ideas?
Well, look, first of all, being a member of Parliament is a great privilege. You are in the greatest most democratic chamber in the world. And what really, the last 6 months has taught me is that there's a real opportunity to affect change. Obviously, we live in this strange time of coronaviruses and something that, if you told me 6 months ago, I would have said to you, you've been watching too many movies. And we live in this era of virtual worlds, and actually we're all a bit separated. And what I found was that throughout this process, we've been able to speak to ministers, be able to speak to each other through WhatsApp conversations and conference calls, and basically learn on a cross-party basis, by the way. So at the start of this, we were having cabinet phone calls every morning to make sure that our shared experience, irrespective of your party affiliations, we were able to affect change. So there's a real opportunity to do that. But look, as a British Muslim, we're all products of our journeys, and the truth of the matter is that centre-right ideologies and centre-right ideas are actually very, very close to the journeys that many British Muslims have taken, whether they're first generation or second generation. You take my father, for example. He gave up everything. He travelled halfway across the world to build a better life for himself. He never took a penny from the state, and his whole driving factor was to build a better life for his family, but also to serve the community that he lived in. And it's those kind of principles that have been instilled in me. And so the idea really is for Muslim for Britain to nurture talent, to take people forward, and basically trying to make the case for why it's actually okay to be, ethnic minority and centre-right and a Conservative, because actually that's the way we're going to succeed.
Okay, thanks a lot, Saqib. I'll come back to you later. I'm very pleased to say that Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House of Commons, has joined our virtual Iftar for this evening. Welcome, Jacob.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. We can both see and hear you, which is in this new virtual world that we all sort of, a goldfish bowl that we all indulge, is a, not an easy thing to say, but we can this evening. So it's very nice of you to join us and give up your time. I'll just be very quick with the introductions. You almost don't really need it. Jacob, as you all know, is leader of the House of Commons and the Lord President of the Council. He was elected as a member of Parliament for North Somerset in 2010, again in 2015-17, and of course in 2019, July, I think it was, Jacob, you were appointed leader of the House of Commons, a very prominent advocate and campaigner for Brexit and much else besides, meetings with the Privy Council. But the main thing I think that needs to really be said is that you are an enormously enthusiastic supporter of Somerset County Cricket Club. That can't be
Yes.
That's really the vital detail, isn't it? Welcome, Jacob. If I could just start off by asking you what you know about Ramadan. I mean, how similar is it to your observation of Lent? I mean, I know about this with my sort of father-in-law who's not Muslim, who's a observant Protestant, but he does observe Lent. I mean, what similarities do you think there are?
Ramadan is much harder. I must confess my admiration for you all is enormous, because Catholic fasting is only required on 2 days of the year, on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. But Catholic fasting allows you to have a meal and a snack. Well, a meal and a snack isn't too bad anyway. And we've got gradually softer and softer that Lent was a period of very serious fasting. And if you go back to the Middle Ages, an almost vegan diet was observed during Lent, particularly by religious communities. But as we've become more modern, we've become less thorough. And so I tend to give up alcohol for Lent. And I observe the 2 days of fasting, and I try to avoid eating fish on Fridays, but only really at home. I don't try and do that if I'm out. So I think we get off very lightly, and I'm full of admiration for people who in busy lives manage to observe really proper fasting all day long. I remember years ago I went to Egypt, and it was during Ramadan, and the temperature was getting up into the 90s, even up to 100 degrees. And our tour guide didn't have a sip of water all day. And I was so impressed by that level of faith and piety. So my admiration for Muslims observing Ramadan is genuine and enormous.
Just a little sub-question to that. I mean, what does the sort of act of fasting mean to you spiritually? I mean, you sort of said that it's perhaps not quite as sort of, full throttled as a sort of Ramadan in this a latitude, whether there's sort of, it's much longer. But what does the actual act of fasting, do you think, how does it add to your faith?
It's a very good question. That what does self-mortification do in terms of faith? And I suppose it is a constant reminder of God. That I'd be interested to know whether you find this, that actually, if you're hungry and you want to have something to eat, or you're thirsty and you want a glass of water, and you're not doing it out of love of God, that is a reminder of God that's very present in your daily life. So whereas prayer is a very active part of faith, that you kneel down to prayer, or you go through your prayers, or however you do it, and you have to carve out special time to pray. With fasting, it lasts all day long, and so you're thinking about God as you feel hungry. You think, well, I'm going to remain hungry because of my love for God, and because for all the great things he does for me. The least payback I can give, this modest payback I can give, is to be thinking about him during the course of the day. And I think that's the purpose of it.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And it also just sort of teaches you about, sacrifice, and also that those that go through this kind of deprivation for the same sort of faith, out of circumstance. Could I ask you? I mean, for you, obviously, it's you've been very open about it. You've been very sort of articulate about it. That faith is a fundamental part of your life. What role does it play in your public life?
Both a very important one and not a great one. That is to say, most of the time, political life is very secular, that there's very little religion that comes into it. And I mean, I think that's a good thing in many ways. On the other hand, it's fundamental to everything that I believe. What is the basic belief? It is love God and love your neighbor. And that if you love your neighbor, you value every soul, and you realize that everybody in your community is of equal importance and equal worth, and equally loved by God. And if God loves us all equally, then as a politician, surely you should aim to serve everybody equally, and you should try not to be judgmental about people, because whatever they do, they are still loved by God. And you should also recognize, as an MP in a constituency surgery, if somebody comes to you for help, helping them is important because they are loved by God, even if what they're asking for your help for isn't important. And some people come to you about very major things, and some people about less important ones, but each one is of great value to that individual, who is important because that individual is loved by God.
We do at the same time, it's stating the sort of obvious, live in a society made up of fellow citizens of many different sort of faiths, and plenty of them with no faith at all. You think faith, I mean, in some ways you sort of answered it from a personal point of view, but do you think faith plays, what part should it play in shaping society, do you think?
Well, I think historically the role of faith in shaping society has been of enormous importance. And if you look at countries across the world, you will see the importance that religion has had in shaping the societies as they have developed and evolved. You see it throughout our system. And you see it, to go back to my point about the individual and each individual having a soul that is of value. I think that underpins the structures in many countries across the world, and that if you go back to ancient times, then that wasn't the case. And actually, the monotheistic religions tend to recognize that each soul is equally valued by God, whereas the pantheistic religions really didn't take that view. And so it's a major presence in daily life that comes, I think, from monotheistic religions that affects people, whether they've got faith or not.
Okay. One last sort of question, Jacob, well, not last, but I mean, just for this sort of section, before I go to Iftikhar Awan, Daniel was sort of summed up for us earlier, Daniel Hannon, that, in a sort of potted sort of history that, going back 30, 40 years in this country, there was a sort of view that, centre-right ideas, and certainly the Conservative Party was not for, British Muslims, and they would just vote, for the other side, as it were. What has, seeing the work of Muslims for Britain, and also what we've seen in the changes in our country these last 18 or 3 years over the referendum and afterwards, what has it taught you about how that sort of worldview has broken down? And second part of that question is, what do you think people who are of the centre-right need to do in order to make that kind of change within the sort of British Muslim sort of society, whether it's from Brexit or anything else, or patriotism, cemented and real in the way that many people already feel it is real within the community? So it's a long-winded way of asking, but what does the conservatives need to do in order to sort of make this a reality?
It's a question that also applies from a Catholic point of view, because if you go back to the 1960s, you would find that most Catholics voted Labour, and that the centre-right was poorly represented by Catholic voters. And the question is, why is that? Why have the centre-right not been good at appealing to everybody? And what can we do to put that right? And I think the answer is to look at our shared values, because what underpins political decision-making is, in the end, values. And the question we all need to ask ourselves about politicians is that politician on my side? And we as politicians, people like me, have responsibility to show to all communities that we are on their side. And this ties in with what I was saying at the beginning about the value of all souls, that we want to show that we are there to represent everybody, but that also we genuinely have similar values. And I think, to go back to the monotheistic religions, that actually the centre-right is more tolerant of religious belief than most other parts of the political spectrum. We still value it, we still see its importance. Many of us still hold deep religious faith, and therefore we are on the side of people from religious communities. And that if we can show we share values, then we can hope that people will vote for us and perhaps listen to our economic arguments and our detailed policy arguments. But I don't think that somebody who accepts your economic argument will vote for you if he or she doesn't share your values. So it's getting back to first principles, emphasizing those, and the basic political idea of being on the side of the people you're asking to vote for you, which the Conservatives did so well during the Brexit debate. We were on the side of widespread and various communities, rather than being in favour of what you might call the establishment. And I accept, speaking as I do from my background, saying rude things about the establishment may seem unlikely. But nonetheless, that was where the Brexit argument came from. It was on the side of British people rather than of elites. And that's really important politically.
And do you think that Muslims for Britain, in terms of the way they articulated some of that sort of values and sold it, for want of a better phrase rather, do you think they have helped to sort of change perceptions, make that a reality?
Oh, I think they were very important in this. I think that the pro-Europeans were very surprised by the success of Muslims for Britain and by the voting patterns that were shown during the Brexit result. I think that lots of communities that the Remainers thought would be automatically voting for them turned out not to be, because they felt they had been ignored, and Muslims for Britain was a very important part of that process and that political evolution.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Don't go away. I'm sure there'll be other sort of questions for you, but thank you very much. If you can stay on, would be appreciated. Iftikhar Awan, it's a great pleasure, Iftikhar, to have you here. President for Muslims for Britain and the co-founder. Iftikhar has over 30 years experience working in the private and public sector, specializes in program, project and change management, business consulting, founding member of a huge number of community organizations, currently chairman at Muslim Aid, a huge national sort of organization, charity, and he's actively involved in interfaith and community cohesion. Iftikhar's appeared on BBC television, talk about his faith, and on BBC radio, and many other sorts of forums. Great to have you here. Iftikhar, you've heard a lot about sort of, Islam and capitalism and Islam in the public domain and the sphere from Dan and Saqib and everyone else who's been on this, and just recently from Jacob. What role do you think faith can play in the public sphere?
Faith is extremely important. All societies and communities are based on values, aren't they? Mm. And I think that the values, and I think that Jacob spoke about that one is the economic thing, but actually values are the things that kind of bind people. And faith communities are actually, if you think about it, when people are of a faith and they follow their faith quite strongly, there are rules and regulations on faith. So generally speaking, people of faith are people who believe in the rule of law, which is, I think, a very important value of democracy. So I think that's one of the very strong points. Also believe very much strongly in community cohesion, about bringing people together, about being merciful, about being kind, and accepting people for who they are. And again, I think Jacob kind of spoke about that God loves man, and we should be therefore kind and merciful to other human beings. So I think that faith makes societies strong in terms of cohesion, but also giving it stability as well. Of course, family values are very much part of Islam. The basic building block of society, we believe as Muslims, is the nuclear family, which then forms part of neighborhoods, which form part of communities, which form part of nations. So I think for me, faith is very important, and also in the way that you conduct yourself as a person of faith, because you have integrity, you believe in honest dealing, you believe in behavior and manners. So these are all, I think, very, very strong and important principles that faith brings to create a very strong and cohesive society.
I'd like to ask you, though, if to come in a really purely practical sort of political in the arena of sort of actual politics. Muslims for Britain have been incredibly effective, much against sort of the traditional sort of thinking that pushing the sort of ideas and principles would not succeed. Where do you see, what's your hopes for Muslims for Britain? It's shown itself to be an incredibly effective campaign body with ideas that no one gave much chance to within the British Muslim community. What's next?
Yeah, well, again, let's just go back a little bit. First of all, in terms of the Islamic values which kind of drive Muslims for Britain. Actually, it's Islam. As a Muslim, you are centrist. Islam is, the Prophet said, is the middle way. As a Muslim, you're not supposed to be extreme in any form, which is why the extremists actually don't represent Islam. Islam is the middle way. So being centrist, if you like, is part of the natural way of being Muslim. And again, Dan kind of referred to the history of Islam and the Prophet himself being somebody who was a trader, a free trader from those circumstances that he talked about. Not only himself, but also the caliphs. There's a very famous story of Abu Bakr, when he went into Medina, and he was offered money from the Medians to help to help him have a living, and he said, no, I don't need that. Just show me where the marketplace is. So he went and did trading, and that's why when you look at the history of Islam and you look at within 100 years, the Muslims were managing and controlling the trade routes from west to east and also north to south, deep into Africa as well. And it was Muslims who invented the letter of credit, and it was Muslims who invented the check to allow that international trade to go on. So that is our history, and actually, when you start looking at that, you can see that why it's so important that actually Muslims sort of favor that sort of centrist policy about free trade, about engaging with the world globally. And I think so. This is where. So we got involved as Muslims for Britain in the Brexit campaign because we strongly believed in a Britain which was open to the world, which traded internationally, where a doctor from India, Pakistan, or Australia had an equal chance to come and work in the UK as a doctor from Europe. And I think what we can do and what we want to try and do with Muslims for Britain is to kind of be a champion for that sort of centrist economic policy, working for sustainable economic growth, because sustainability is also a very important part of being Muslim. You're a Khalifa of the earth, you're a steward of the earth, so therefore sustainable economic growth is very, very important to us. The environment and conservation, these are areas which are important globally because the big thing is the environment. It's going to affect us all. So I think Muslims for Britain have a great part to play in that. So I think we can sort of help get that conversation going and help with the development of policy.
Jacob, I don't know if you've had much time to. Dan was rumbling through his hamper, his Muslims for Britain hamper, and was getting ready to tuck into some pistachios and barfi from elsewhere. I mean, have you managed to rumble around your hamper?
Oh, I have indeed, and I'm particularly looking forward to the Turkish coffee because I drink coffee endlessly. My confession on fasting, on day of fasting, as I was mentioning earlier, I always used to try and give up coffee, but I discovered by the end of the day I had such a terrible headache that I'm afraid I had to give up giving up coffee. So that's what I'm particularly looking forward to.
Okay. Dan, you didn't actually say what your favourite bit of the hamper was. You held up a few sort of things. I think the pistachios made an appearance earlier on, Daniel. I mean,
I love pistachios, yes. And I'm looking forward to the dates and the figs. But I've got to ask, and it's a question to you, Raghi, and to Jacob, and I think I speak for all the other chaps in this. How have you managed to keep your hair looking so good despite 10 weeks of lockdown now?
I mean, I think Jacob's headed to an even bigger afro than me, I should say. But I actually spend my time patting down my hair. I got it cut very short. I don't know why. Thank goodness I did. But two things I can't stand is long nails and long hair. I can do things about nails. Hair I can't do anything about. Over to you, ReesMogg.
Well, I share your irritation with long hair. It feels so long at the back. I haven't ever gone so long without a haircut. But fortunately, I had a haircut the week before lockdown began, so I'm just about all right. Are
you going to invite any of your children to come and get the shears to your hair?
No, I'm not. I have 3 sheep in Somerset, and therefore do have a pair of sheep shears.
That's why I asked.
They're not going to be let loose on me.
Children. Those of you know me. Those of you know me know that this is not my normal hairstyle. So again, my hair started bushing out. I had to get to the shears and do a very drastic cut.
I know. Naveed might have something to say about that. I don't know if he's there.
I wonder whether anyone's got something to say about my hair. Anybody got the courage?
Your hair looks amazing, Atifa.
Good.
Much better than mine and Jacob's, anyway.
Absolutely.
It's great. Well, look, time is nearly ticking down. We've only got a few more minutes to hang on until we break fast. I think it's about another 6 minutes, I think. One of the things...
Depends on where you are, again.
Sorry?
It depends on where you are, I suppose. If you're in London, I think you're approaching breaking of fast. In Manchester, we're about 10 past 9.
Oh, really? Are you? Okay. Well,
so we'll all be breaking fast at different times.
Yeah, we're 2 minutes to.
But I don't know whether you want to talk about the significance of the different pieces that were in the hamper.
Yeah, that's
why we selected those pieces.
Can you talk us through that, because it's very well thought through, sort of lovely sort of reminder of the extraordinarily long links, trading links of this country with all parts of the Muslim world over through the ages.
Well, trading and diplomatic, of course. Because first of all, you've got the Moroccan tea in your hamper. That's one of the things. We've got Turkish coffee, but you've got Moroccan tea. And of course, the Moroccan tea relates to our very first diplomatic relationship, our longest established diplomatic relationship, which goes back to Morocco in 1213, when King John established a diplomatic relationship with the then Sultan Muhammad Nasir of Morocco, to help him in terms of his sort of differences with his European country people, and so therefore an emissary was sort of sent, and the diplomatic relationships were established with Morocco, which have been the longest continuing diplomatic relations in history, which lasted now 800 years. So that's where the relationship with the tea comes in, and then you've got the burfi. White burfi. Yep. So that's a traditional sweet from the Indian subcontinent, and what that represents is, as you know, both in the World War I and in World War II, we had hundreds of thousands of subcontinent soldiers coming to fight both in Europe, but also on the other different fronts as well. There were about 1.5 million, I think, from the Indian subcontinent, of which something like 400,000 were Muslims. And in the First World War, one of the VC winners was Zak Khan. He won a Victoria Cross actually for his bravery in Belgium. And he's been commemorated. There's a statue of him there as well. And in the Second World War, again, hundreds of thousands from the Indian subcontinent came over. My father was in the Royal Indian Air Force during the Second World War, and I have his Second World War medals and wear them very proudly on Remembrance Sunday. Then you've got, of course, you've got the pistachios.
Oh yeah.
Which link ourselves with the kind of Persian heritage that we've got, and then the Turkish coffee. Of course, the first Brexit happened in Elizabethan times, when the Pope broke off relationships with Britain, and there was excommunication by the other European countries for Britain. And where did Queen Elizabeth turn to? But she turned to the Ottoman Empire, which was one of the leading empires at that time, and established relationships with the Sultan Murad at the time. And actually, when you look at Elizabethan Britain, if you went back to those times, you would have seen many Muslim merchants and traders walking along London and the great centres of Britain. So that history is very, very important. And of course, when you look at the plays which were written during that period, including obviously Shakespearean plays, Othello, Merchant of Venice, you have Muslim characters, within that as well. And the dates are from, these are Ajwa dates from Saudi Arabia. The Ajwa dates were the favorite dates of the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, our relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia goes back to its foundations, and Britain's very important role in establishing that kingdom, and the long-term relationship and the very warm relationships we've had with that as well.
Let me
so all of these are very significant.
No, they are. Thank you, Iftar. Dan, you've got quite a bit of you've written about and sort of talked about. I mean, the significance of some of the things in our sort of hampers, especially as it relates to the two world wars.
Yes, I mean it's a really interesting thing. As Iftikhar just said, we have this very old set of alliances, the trading concessions that Elizabeth I negotiated with Turkey, capitulations they were called, lasted until 1923, the final dissolution of the Ottoman monarchy. But it's if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, when it became clear that Turkey was going to join the war on Germany's side, was going to drift into the German armpit, there was a lot of fretting in the cabinet of people saying, well, what impact will this have on British Muslims, in India and Egypt and so on? We would have, the prospect was there of a war, as happened, between Britain, not just and the leading Muslim country, but the Caliph, the commander of the faithful. And of course, the answer was that in the First World War, British Muslims, if anything, volunteered in slightly higher numbers than some of the other colonial populations. All volunteers. There was no conscription in India or Egypt or Malaya, because they felt part of a system of values that they were proud of. And then their sons did the same thing in the Second World War, like Iftikhar's dad, in even greater numbers. The greatest volunteer army ever was the Indian Army in the Second World War, with around 400,000 Indian Muslims in it, in what was then British India. And so, I come back to saying that none of this is new. These are not unprecedented questions that we're facing. We go back a long way together. And the idea that a British Muslim needs to kind of feel his way to a new identity, if there's any country in Europe where you should, where you can become part of it by signing up to the values and a civil rather than an ethnic sense of nationhood, it's this one.
Jacob, have you had much of a sort of, you mentioned you visited Egypt. Have you sort of had a chance through sort of work or privately to sort of visit different parts of the world which are sort of Muslim societies at any time in your life?
Yes, I've visited Egypt. I've been to Turkey. For business, I used to travel a bit in the Far East, so went to both Indonesia and Malaysia. My background was as an emerging markets investor, so Indonesia and Malaysia I was investing in for my clients, but then I had clients from the Middle East as well. So I've traveled a bit in Muslim countries.
I think one of the things that is sort of people sort of don't sort of realize significantly, I mean, whether they sort of live here or not, is just the enormous sort of, we speak very easily about the sort of the Muslim world, but it's I suppose, as Dan was sort of saying, no country in the West quite encapsulate the enormous diversity you've just sort of mentioned, from Indonesia to Egypt to Turkey, as the United Kingdom. I mean, in all its corners for hundreds of years.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, because to be perfectly honest, this is the first time that I've thought of those visits as being specifically related to visiting Muslim countries. Of course, I knew that they had large Muslim populations, but you're absolutely spot on. They are very, very different countries, different political traditions and histories, but they have an underlying religious faith. But it would be, I suppose, odd to think of oneself going to the United States or to Italy and France and saying, I was visiting the Christian world. I think it's
right.
One sometimes generalizes about religion, because it's convenient to do, but it isn't always accurate.
Yeah, exactly. Or sort of saying that you go from sort of Poland to sort of Mexico, and you're visiting the sort of the Catholic world. I mean, it's not quite.
I can tell you, I've been to Mass in both Poland and in Brazil, and it's a very, very different experience.
Absolutely. I'd like to sort of bring in Saqib back again, Saqib. I mean, I have to ask you, I mean, what's it like, fasting Ramadan as an MP? Is it any different to fasting before you're an MP?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure I can answer that in normal times because since I've been fasting, it's been absolutely. I should obviously say welcome to the leader. He's done an absolutely sterling job in navigating the House through these kind of hybrid proceedings that we're kind of experiencing at the moment. I'd say my first 6 months have been split up into two separate periods. The first 2.5 months where life was normal, if you can call it that, and you kind of walk into, this building which is steeped in tradition and history, the center of democracy of the world, I would call it. And some of my colleagues refer to it as Hogwarts, and it was just a very surreal experience. You spend all this time trying to get your feet on the table, trying to make sure you are a good member of parliament for your constituents, which is obviously the priority. And then all of a sudden you get hit with something like Corona, which has transformed everything. And we're kind of working remotely and you're in this kind of surreal kind of experience where you're trying to scrutinize legislation and also serve your constituents. And I think when Corona actually hit, I think it's worth pointing out, in the first 2 weeks we had around 2,000 emails come in, and it just goes to show when Jacob was talking about serving and helping your neighbour, the amount of people who needed support in that early period was so important, and it really brought home why I took on the role, really.
Okay, Saqib, thank you very much. And I think we should let people break fast, but also I know, Jacob, you need to get going. Thank you very much for giving of your time. Hugely, very, very...
And on behalf of Muslims for Britain, could I just say a great big thank you to Jacob ReesMogg for actually kindly agreeing to join our cell today. Very gracious of you. And
it's been my pleasure and honour. And what's more, I've got supper out of it because I'm in London by myself, and when I'm in London by myself, I don't get very much to eat, to be perfectly honest. So I'm extremely grateful that you've both invited me.
I hope you enjoy it
with my dinner. So thank you so much.
And we look forward to continuing to work with you and making this country great.
Thank you.
Can I say, if no one else is going to say so, thank you to you, Raghi, for chairing that so well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been really interesting with some very interesting and dynamic and interesting people. Thank you. And,
thank you.
Happy fast. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.